this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on parallel flaw questions in the logical reasoning section. And while it's not the most common question type out there, there's only 4% of logical reasoning questions that are parallel flaw questions. Together with parallel questions, they do make up 7% total. And so the art of paralleling is an important task in logical reasoning. In today's lesson, we want to cover the following. First, how do you spot a parallel flaw question? What's the process for approaching one? And then how do you use structure and validity to parallel the particular flaw? And what kinds of traps should you be on the lookout for as you answer the question? So the way you spot a parallel flaw question is in the question stem itself. You're looking for language that's something like, which one of the following has flawed reasoning, most similar to the flawed reasoning in the argument above? The most similar tells you that you're looking to parallel. The flawed reasoning tells you that it's a flaw. Together, that tells you that you're looking at a parallel flaw question. Or you might see language like this: the flawed pattern of reasoning in which one of the following arguments most parallels the flawed pattern of reasoning in the argument above. Pretty obvious that you're looking at flawed reasoning and you're looking for one that parallels the flawed reasoning above. Or the flawed pattern of reasoning in which one of the following arguments most closely resembles the flawed pattern of reasoning. So in each of these cases, essentially what we have is flawed reasoning, and they're telling us that, and they're also telling us that we're looking for an argument that either parallels or is similar or resembles the argument in the stimulus. Now, the reasoning structures that play a major role in parallel flaw questions, conditional logic is a major driver. So 55% of parallel flaw questions rest on conditional logic as the argument structure. So let's take a look at how that works. Here's an example. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you think you have an answer that you like, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll review it together. All right, welcome back. So let's first take a look at the stimulus itself and see if we can figure out what is the flawed pattern of reasoning that we're trying to parallel in this question. Now, the first premise tells us that no member of the Richardson Theater Group is both a performer and an administrator. So if you're a member of the Richardson Theater Group, you cannot be both. And not being both means that either you're not a performer or you're not an administrator. It's possible that you're neither, but it's definitely not the case that you're both. So not being both means lacking one or else the other. So now the next statement tells us that Leon and Marta are both members of the Richardson Theater Group, but neither is an administrator. Okay, so they're members of the Richardson Theater Group and they're not administrators. And then it goes on to conclude from that, it follows that both are performers. Okay, well, if you think about it, what this is really doing is it's assuming that you have to be one or else the other. Right? We know that you can't be both, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be one or else the other. The implication in this conclusion is that since they're not an administrator, that they must be a performer. So had the first premise said something like, if you're a member of the Richardson Theater Group, then either you're a performer or an administrator, this would have been fine. But we didn't get that. And it's still possible that someone is neither an administrator nor a performer. And since these two are not administrators, it does not follow that they're definitely performers. So we can try to parallel that logical structure in the answer choices to see if we can find one that looks like it's going to parallel the reasoning. So now let's look at answer choice A. It says that not all of the employees at the Terenko company are salaried employees of the company. So some of the employees are simply not salaried. Not all of them are salaried. It means that some of them are not salaried. So now the next statement tells us that Mr. Lopez and Miss Allen are both salaried employees of the Terenko company. So Lopez is salaried and Allen is salaried. Fine. Okay, what else do we know? Well, they say that it follows that they are not the only employees of the Terenko company. So that some of the employees are not Lopez and not Allen. So now let's compare this with the stimulus. There's quite a few differences here. First, notice that in the first premise we have a sum statement, while in the stimulus we have an all statement. And then in the second statement of answer choice A, it leads us with essentially two conditionals. Lopez is salaried and Allen is salaried. While in the stimulus, we had like this and statement. This person is a member of the Richardson Theater Group and not an administrator. But that's different, right? We don't have a conditional in the second premise. So there's a mismatch on the first premise. There's a mismatch on the second premise. The conclusion is also a relationship instead of a statement of fact. So there's a conclusion there. And then if we dig really deep, you notice that if some of the employees are not salaried, while Lopez and Allen are salaried, it does follow that some of the employees are neither Lopez nor Allen. So this actually isn't even bad argument. This is a valid reasoning. The validity doesn't even match. Okay, so this is wrong on a whole bunch of fronts. Let's get rid of A and keep looking. So now let's look at answer choice B. It tells us that no employee of the Tedesco company is both an accountant and a corporate attorney. So if you're an employee, then you're not an accountant or you're not an attorney because you can't be both. And this matches pretty good with the stimulus. So let's see what else they give us. Then it goes on to tell us that Miss Walsh is both an accountant and a corporate attorney. This may have a problem, though. Notice that this person is an accountant and attorney, but that doesn't tell us that this person is an employee at Tedesco. Whereas in the original argument, the second premise told us that that trigger of the first relationship is true. It told us that this person is a member of the Richardson Theater Group. But we don't get that in the second premise in answer choice B. So that may be enough to go ahead and get rid of this answer choice. But let's just see what else they give us. It goes on to conclude that this person is therefore not an employee. Well, okay, so the second premise has definitely got a mismatch because it's not hitting that trigger of the first relationship. Then the conclusion is also not a match because this is basically concluding that the trigger of the first relationship is not true, whereas in the conclusion of the stimulus, it was that this person is a performer, which is the opposite of one of the two or terms. So we have got a mismatch in the premise, we got a mismatch in the conclusion, and we also have a mismatch in the validity because this argument is actually a valid argument. If no employee is both an accountant and an attorney, meaning you're either not one or not the other, and this person is both, and this person is definitely not an employee at the Tedesco company, that's a valid argument. That uses contrapositive reasoning. So we can get rid of answer choice B. Answer choice C. No company can have its headquarters in both Canada and Mexico. So if your company, either your headquarters is not in Canada or it's not in Mexico. It can't be in both. And then they tell us that neither the Dumont company nor the Tedesco company has its headquarters in Mexico. So now let's look at the second premise. It says that neither the Dumont company nor the Tedesco company has its headquarters in Mexico. So these two companies, they're companies, and yet their headquarters are not in Mexico. So this tells us that we actually have met the sufficient condition of the original rule and that it's not the case that it's in Mexico. So far this is actually matching pretty well because they're giving us both the trigger and one of the outcomes, right? Since they're saying it's either not in Canada or not in Mexico, and they're giving us not in Mexico, that matches just like in the original stimulus where this person was not an administrator, right? So it was not an administrator. They go on to conclude that this person was a performer. If this argument goes on to conclude that this company or that these companies have their headquarters in Canada, then it will be a match of the argument. So then it goes on to say, it follows that both have their headquarters in Canada. This looks perfect, right? They're giving us the if-then rule. They're telling us that trigger is true and that one of those outcomes is true and concluding that the other outcome is not true, but that doesn't necessarily follow. So this looks like it's going to be our answer. Let's hold on to answer choice C, make sure that we don't get tempted with anything else as we look at D and E, and otherwise we can pick it with confidence. All right, so now let's look at answer choice D. It says that no corporate attorney represents both the Dumont company and the Tedesco company. So if you're a corporate attorney, then either you don't represent the Dumont company or you don't represent the Tedesco company. Now, the second statement tells us that Ms. Tsung is a corporate attorney who represents the Dumont company, right? So she's an attorney and she represents the Dumont company. This is already a little bit different. It does meet the trigger of the if-then rule, but it doesn't meet one of the outcomes. It doesn't meet one of the necessary conditions, right? They tell us that in the stimulus, they tell us that these people are not administrators, right? Which matches the outcomes in the stimulus. But now in answer choice, in D, Ms. Tsung does represent the Dumont company, right? That's the opposite of one of those two outcomes in the trigger. So if the conclusion goes on to say that Ms. Tsung does not represent the Tedesco company, then this would be actually a valid argument. And that's exactly what this argument concludes. So while the first statement is perfectly fine, the second premise is not fine because it does not meet one of the outcomes in the or statement. And then secondarily, it's got the wrong conclusion, right? Because they're reaching the conclusion that one of those two things in the outcome are true, as opposed to reaching that one of those two things in the outcome is not true. And then finally, it's got the wrong validity. This argument is a valid argument, while the argument in the stimulus is an invalid argument. So now finally, answer choice E. It says that no member of the board of directors of the Dumont company is also a member of the board of directors of the Tedesco company. So if you're a member of the Dumont company board, then you're not a member of the Tedesco company board. Already, this has got a mismatch. This is not the right answer, but we can keep looking at it just to make sure what else is wrong with it, if there's anything else wrong with it. So then the second statement tells us that neither company has fewer than 5 board members. So if the Damone company has greater than 5 board members and the Didenko company has greater than 5 board members, again, this is a different kind of relationship than that was in the second premise of the stimulus. So this looks like a mismatch as well. And then the conclusion goes on to say that it follows that both boards together include at least 10 members. Okay, so if you take the number of board members in both of the two companies, add them together, it's going to be greater than 10. Since each had greater than 5, or at least 5 on their own, then yeah, this is going to be true actually. So this answer has a bunch of things wrong with it. First, the premise is wrong because it doesn't have an or statement in the outcome. The second premise is wrong because it gives us like this idea of a greater than or equal to amount. And then the conclusion is wrong because it's also a relationship as opposed to a fact. They're saying it's greater than 10, but I mean that kind of a relative relationship isn't included in the stimulus's conclusion. So this is wrong on a bunch of fronts. It's also got the wrong validity. If you take those premises together and you add them up, it's true that if no member of the Damone company is a member of the Didenko company, and each company has at least 5 or more people on their board members, if no member of the board on the Damone company is also a member of the board on the Didenko company, and each board has at least 5 members on it, then it follows that combined they have at least 10 members between the two. So it's actually a valid argument. It's a mismatch, and answer choice C was correct. So then the second reasoning structure that you really want to pay attention to on parallel flaw questions is the comparison. Right? So we're going to look at a comparison question here. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you think you have an answer that you like, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll work it through together. Okay, welcome back. So let's take a closer look at the argument. It says that food that is very high in fat tends to be unhealthy. And these brownies are fat-free, while those cookies contain a high percentage of fat. Okay, so if the cookies contain a high percentage of fat and food that is very high in fat tends to be unhealthy, that might allow us to conclude that these cookies are unhealthy. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the cookies are healthier than the brownies, or that so let's say the brownies are healthier than cookies, because the brownies, like, just because they're fat-free, we don't actually know anything about fat-free foods. Like, there are many other things that could lead them to being unhealthy. So to make the comparison that these fat-free brownies are healthier than these cookies are, doesn't follow from the evidence that's given. They're giving us a relative comparison in the conclusion, while they're giving us a statement of fact in the evidence, and that might be something that we can use to help figure out which one of these answer choices most closely parallels the flaw. If we look at answer choice A, it says that canned foods always contain more salt than frozen foods do. So there's a relative comparison in the premise. That's a red flag. Let's get rid of it. So if we look at answer choice A, it says that canned foods always contain more salt than frozen foods do. Okay, so there's a relative comparison in the evidence, and we didn't get that in the original argument. So that's probably grounds enough to dismiss answer choice A. It goes on to say, therefore, that these canned peas contain more salt than those frozen peas do. So answer choice A actually has that relative comparison in both the premise and in the conclusion. It's wrong. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice B says that vegetables that are overcooked generally have few vitamins. Therefore, these carrots, which are overcooked, contain fewer vitamins than those peas, which are uncooked. Okay, so vegetables that are overcooked generally have few vitamins. That's very much like the food that is very high in fat tends to be unhealthy. And they tell us that these carrots are overcooked, while these peas are uncooked. That's very much like the premise or the premises in the stimulus, where these brownies are fat-free while those cookies contain a high percentage of fat. And it goes on to conclude that these carrots contain fewer vitamins than those peas. So there's a relative comparison. So they give us the statement of fact and then the relative comparison, the statement of fact in the premise and the relative comparison in the conclusion. This looks like a good match. Let's hold on to it and see what we get with the other choices. Answer choice C says that the human body needs certain amounts of many minerals to remain healthy. Okay, the idea that you need something, that's a different kind of a premise than what was given initially. Therefore, this distilled water, which has no minerals, is unhealthy. Well, okay, that doesn't give us a relative comparison. This has actually got both the wrong kind of a premise and the wrong kind of a conclusion, because it doesn't give us the relative comparison in the conclusion, and it gives us a different kind of relationship in the premise. It's wrong. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice D says that some types of nuts make Roy's throat itch. All right, so some, that's not very similar to tends to be. Tends to be is a much stronger idea than some. So the premise, that first premise has got an issue. And then these cookies contain a greater percentage of nuts than that pie contains. Again, that's a relative relationship. That's different than what we had in the original argument. So we've got two premises that are different already. The conclusion goes on to say that these cookies are more likely to make Roy's throat itch. So there's a relative relationship in answer choice D in the conclusion, so that's not bad. But the premises are way off, and so we can get rid of D for having the wrong premise. And then answer choice E, eating at a restaurant costs more than eating food prepared at home. That's a relative relationship. That's different than what we had in the stimulus. Therefore, this home-cooked meal is less expensive than a restaurant meal of the same dishes would be. So again, relative versus relative, that's not the same. It's got the wrong type of premise. Let's get rid of E, and so we can choose B with confidence. Now, the last type of reasoning to take a look at in parallel flaw questions is causation. And while it's not the most dominant player in parallel flaw, it does come up occasionally, so it's important to know how to deal with it. So here's an example. Go ahead and give this one a try, and when you think you've got an answer that you like, hit play again, come back, and we'll review this one together. All right, welcome back. So now let's take a closer look at this argument. It says that the formation of hurricanes that threaten the United States mainland is triggered by high atmospheric winds off the western coast of Africa. And when abundant rain falls in sub-Saharan Africa, hurricanes afterward hit the United States mainland with particular frequency. Therefore, the abundant rains must somehow promote the ability of the winds to form hurricanes. It's important to note in that conclusion the word promote. It's telling us that there's a causal relationship. They're saying that the abundant rains are causing the winds to form hurricanes. Now, what are we told before that about the abundant rains? It says that when abundant rain falls in sub-Saharan Africa, hurricanes afterward hit the United States mainland with particular frequency. Now, there's nothing in that suggests causation. There's only a correlation that's implied by the word when. So when this happens, then we get this other thing that happens. And then they wanted to say that first thing caused the other to occur. So there's a correlation causal relationship that is flawed reasoning here. Right? This argument is mistaking correlation for causation. And we want to find that same thing in the right answer. So if we look at answer choice A, it says that people who exercise vigorously tend to sleep well. Okay, so there's a correlation between exercising vigorously and sleeping well. Therefore, people who exercise vigorously tend to be healthy. Okay, well, I mean, there's a correlation in the conclusion. That's not causal. And then there's a difference between sleeping well and being healthy. So while this is not a good argument, it's not the same flaw that's in the argument above, right? This is mistaking, like allowing one term one term to slip into another, saying that if you sleep well, that you'll be healthy. This maybe rests on an assumption or it has a term shift, however you want to call it, but it's got the wrong flaw. So let's get rid of that. B says that cars drive faster on long city blocks than on short city blocks. Okay, long blocks are thus more dangerous for pedestrians than short blocks. Okay, that's a relative relationship. That's using the wrong type of reasoning, right? That's got the wrong flaw, right? They're saying that it's more dangerous. Cars that drive faster are more dangerous, right? This is assuming, that relationship, and it's got a different kind of conclusion than we were originally looking for. So let's get rid of B. Answer choice C says that many people who later become successful entrepreneurs played competitive sports in college. Therefore, playing competitive sports must enhance a person's entrepreneurial ability. So now that first statement gives us a relative relationship between entrepreneurs and playing competitive sports, right? Most of those who later became successful entrepreneurs played competitive sports. That's a correlation between those two things. Therefore, playing competitive sports must enhance. Enhancing is suggesting that it's a causal feature, right? It's causing it to occur. This looks like a contender. Let's hold on to C. Answer choice D says that the blossoms of the chicory plant close up in full sun. Therefore, the chicory plant's blossoms must open in the dark. Well, if they close up in full sun, does that mean that they have to open in the dark? Not necessarily, right? Maybe they open up in like let's say partial sun as opposed to full sun, right? They don't have to open up in the dark. So this has got the wrong type of flaw. It doesn't ever involve a causal reasoning structure. Let's get rid of this. Answer choice E, events in Eastern Europe can affect the political mood in Central America. That's a problem because notice that they're giving you a causal relationship in the premise itself. Therefore, liberalization in Eastern Europe will lead to liberalization in Central America. That's not exactly true, right? There's a difference between it can affect and it will lead to, right? So both the premise and the conclusion involve causation. The issue here is a degree issue. The conclusion is much stronger than the premise allows you to conclude, so it's got the wrong flaw. Let's get rid of it. That lets us choose C with confidence. And so now we've seen an example of each, conditional logic, comparison, and causation. And what we want to do now is kind of think about the kind of trap answers that we were seeing along the way. So the trap answers that you really want to be on the lookout for, right? 33% of wrong answers on parallel flaw questions are wrong because they have a different kind of a premise. There's a structural mismatch between the premise in the stimulus and the premise in the answer choice. 42% of wrong answers are wrong because they have the wrong conclusion compared with the stimulus, right? Maybe it's a different kind. It's essentially a structural difference that looks different. Okay? Now, answers can be wrong for more than one reason, and on parallel flaw questions that happens quite a bit. So you're going to notice that these frequencies don't add up to 100 because it's not exclusive, right? Many wrong answers have more than one reason why they're wrong, and so what we're really looking at is the frequency of these traps within answer choices, not like how these traps are divided across the choices. So there's also some issues with logic, right? 33% of wrong answers are wrong because they have the wrong validity, meaning if you're looking to parallel the flaw, but the answer choice is a valid argument, it doesn't match the validity. 33% of wrong answers are wrong because they have the wrong flaw, meaning you know that there's a flaw in the stimulus, but this answer choice has a different kind of flaw, and so even though it's flawed, it's not the same flaw. And that actually kind of matches the way flaw questions in general work in logical reasoning. One of the most common trap answer patterns on a flaw question is an answer choice that correctly describes a flaw, but just not one that happened within the argument. And so this trap answer on parallel is very similar in that respect. And then finally, 8% of wrong answers are wrong because they simply have the wrong reasoning. You're looking for causation in the conclusion, and this answer choice has a comparison in the conclusion, or it's got a conditional relationship in the conclusion. But there's a mismatch between the types of reasoning structures in the stimulus and in the answer choice. So remember, the way you spot a parallel flaw question is with the language in the question stem. You're looking for most similar or most parallels or most closely resembles, and you want it to say the flawed reasoning. If it just says the reasoning, then you might be on a parallel reasoning question. It may also be a parallel flaw question, right? Because sometimes they don't always tell you that you're trying to parallel the flawed reasoning. They just ask you to parallel the reasoning, and in which case it could still be a flawed reasoning. But if they tell you that you're trying to parallel the flawed reasoning, it's guaranteed to be a bad argument. And then you're looking for the answer choice that matches that same incorrectness. The important reasoning structures to pay attention to on parallel flaw questions are conditional logic. 55% of parallel flaw questions are built on conditional logic. 43% of parallel flaw questions are built on comparative reasoning structures, and 10% of parallel flaw questions are built on causal reasoning structures. And the important traps to pay attention to: wrong conclusion, meaning there's a structural mismatch there. 42% of them simply have the wrong conclusion, making it a really important place to check. 33% have the wrong premise. 33% have the wrong validity. 33% have the wrong type of flaw, and 8% simply have the wrong reasoning structure altogether. So that's it for today's lesson on parallel flaw questions. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.